It's time to add a story to my game, and there are multiple ways of doing it. In-game cutscenes, visual novels, random snippets from NPCs, but there is one method that I've never come across before. Webcomics. Now wait a minute, that's not that insane. After all, there are whole websites filled with webcomics. They're not all crazy. That's what I'm saying. Those people are also insane. The amount of work that you need to put into these stories is unreal. The only sane people who make webcomics do it as a team, and I am not one of those sane people. But why webcomics? Well, in order to answer that question, let's go through all the choices that I didn't take. First off are in-game cutscenes. These are a relatively inexpensive way to tell the story of your game, especially if your game engine already looks good. But I don't have something like that, since I'm making a 2D card game. Along the same vein, story snippets that you find while playing are also off the table, since there isn't technically a world in my game for the player to explore. Another option is just a pure text storytelling approach, but let's be real, no one's going to read all of that. Then there's the visual novel style that's really popular in anime style games, which mine is, but one thing about these games is that they have really nice voice acting, and in fact, the voice actors themselves are part of the appeal of a visual novel.
私はディアソムニアの副寮長
And I definitely do not have the budget to hire a bunch of voice actors for my game. So that leaves me with webcomics. And the only reason I'm even considering this as an option is because I've done it before in my custom maps. But there was still a lot to consider. The thing about video game cutscenes, or story cinematics, is that they momentarily take the player away from the gameplay. This is actually very tricky to do, and if you do it incorrectly, it can end up ruining the experience. You have to think about when the cutscene occurs, how long it takes, and just the overall entertainment value of it, and its ability to hold a player's attention. We've all complained about unskippable cutscenes before, and that's usually because they fail at one of these three things. I'm of the opinion that cutscenes shouldn't be skippable at all. If a player wants to skip a cutscene, then that's just a bad cutscene. There's always a way to convince the player to pay attention to your story. With that in mind, I began writing the script for my story. My plan was for the story to be broken up into episodes, and each episode would introduce a new playable character and boss, as well as a slew of unique enemies. In addition, I decided that my story scenes should take place in 3 places: at the beginning of an episode, in the middle of an act, and after a boss fight. With 3 acts per episode, that means 7 cutscenes in total, which isn't a lot, but doing so forces me to make sure that each cutscene is clear and to the point and progresses the story in a meaningful way. There are no throwaway cutscenes. I mean, it takes forever to draw one of these, so they better be worth it. But actually writing a story considering these constraints was quite the experience. How did they go from fighting this boss to that boss in the span of 1 episode? And how did they collect all these friends along the way? I struggled with this and ended up checking out Brandon Sanderson's lectures on creative writing, which are pretty amazing. I took a bunch of notes and tried applying them to my story, which helped me structure everything. Each scene should accomplish something, whether it be character development, plot progression, setting up the world, and so on. I'm not going to spoil the story for now, so we'll have to see how things go when the demo is released and you'll be able to play the first chapter. After the script was ready, it was time to code! I wanted to write a custom script that could produce a speech bubble given some specific string of text and coordinates for where the bubble will go. I wanted this for localization purposes. Eventually, my game will support multiple languages, and the speech bubbles may vary in size depending on the language. Apparently, Godot has some good translation features, but I have yet to look into that. The more important thing was to have dynamic bubbles that could fit any amount of text, and this was not easy. First, I figured out an algorithm for dynamically changing the text box so that it looks relatively squarish. This algorithm would continuously increase the width of the text box until its width was greater than its height. I did this by counting the number of characters in each word and then adding words to the first line until the estimated height of the text was less than the width. Once that was done, I needed to add the speech bubbles underneath. Now, speech bubbles are ovals, and I knew I wanted a black oval and a smaller white oval over it to get that nice outline. I managed a pretty simple formula for how big an oval should be to contain all the text in the speech bubble, and making one that's slightly larger than that should be fairly easy. Or so I thought. The problem is, if I just scale the black oval up by a percentage, then it produces an uneven border. The sides will be thicker than the top and the bottom. I went on quite a researching journey about ellipses and parallel shapes and came across this ugly thing. There's no way I'm using that. Then I realized maybe it isn't actually that complicated after all. An ellipse is actually just a stretched circle, so if the black oval is also stretched but proportional to this desired offset on the y-axis and the x-axis, then I could get this consistent thickness. Next, I added the little pointer that indicates who's talking. This was just a simple triangle that was again calculated to have uniform thickness on its borders. The pointer meshes with the bubble because the white shapes are on a layer above the black shapes. This is also really cool because I can merge two speech bubbles together and it looks exactly the way I want it to. Finally, I had to support different bubble shapes, such as rectangles and shouting bubbles. Rectangles were very easy, but the shouting bubbles were the hard part though. You see, Godot claims to support custom drawing, but that customization is limited to simple polygons and circles. If I want a unique shape like this, it's going to require a lot more work. My first idea was to have a large rectangle and then use a circular eraser to take bites out of it to form that spiky shape. The problem is, Godot doesn't support this masking feature. It's a feature that a lot of people have been asking for, but I did end up finding a workaround. Godot has a create image from data function, where you can manually generate the image pixel by pixel in code. So that's what I ended up doing. I generated a massive array of pixels and used circles of varying sizes to bite out parts of the rectangle to create that spiky speech bubble. Then I used slightly larger circles to bite out parts of an identical rectangle to get that smaller white shape that sits on top of the black one. Now I finally had working speech bubbles, and no more excuses. It was time to draw. And I'm telling you guys right now, my art is not that good, so lower your expectations. Each page took about 1 or 2 hours to draw, and it ended up being like 2 seconds of content for the player. But I actually found it very relaxing to draw all these panels. The only decision making I needed was at the very beginning when I was setting up the page. I had to figure out where to place the panels and speech bubbles as well as the position and perspective of the characters. I've never actually learned about cinematography, but I at least understand the basics, such as starting with a wide shot to let the reader know where the characters are before zooming in, and using cameras of different heights and angles to convey different things. For example, looking up at something makes it seem big and powerful, while looking down has the exact opposite effect. Meanwhile, an eye-level shot can convey honesty and calmness. I also had to make sure that the camera showed the characters from left to right so that the speech bubbles never crossed, which is a lot trickier than you might think. But once I figured out all this complicated stuff, it was just smooth sailing to draw in the actual details. I could just autopilot and listen to a podcast while drawing. In fact, I spent many nights just hopping into Discord with friends and watching them play games, which was kind of funny because I'd be drawing comics while watching them skip all the cutscenes in the games they were playing. But alas, I finished the first episode and put it in my game, is this thing broken? Oh, there we go. Well, this isn't good. It takes quite a while to load in all the panels. I'm going to need a loading screen. So, I spent a couple minutes in Clip Studio and made this cute little thing. I added an oscillation to its opacity to let the player know stuff was happening. Alright, now check this out. Look at it go. It's perfect. Why is it frozen? Why is it frozen? I mean, it's a... Okay, so it turns out that the function I'm using loads data asynchronously as intended, but there is a second step of adding the objects to the game. But this step is done in the main thread, so the loading screen ends up pausing at the end for several seconds, and it looks like the game's frozen. Great. I need to find a solution to this. Option 1. Load and add literally everything during startup. The player isn't going to notice some extra seconds during the startup, right? But it already takes 10 seconds to load the first chapter, and there's going to be a lot more, so players are going to have to sit through like a minute of load time. That's not good. Option 2. Load all the comics for an episode when you start that episode. Yuck. This splits up the load time, but we still end up with several seconds of loading and adding objects at the start of an episode, not to mention the fact that the game still freezes as it's adding everything, making the player wonder if it's still running. Option 3, the one I really don't want to do because it's a lot of work. Load images as the player reads, in much smaller chunks. For example, while a player is reading this panel, I can secretly load subsequent panels without them realizing what's happening. There will be lag, but the player won't notice because the game isn't moving and they're busy reading. The problem with this is I have to split everything into files, and it's not as straightforward as it seems. You see, the files are numbered, and programmers might think it's as simple as loading the files by number with a simple for loop. Except the problem is that these speech bubbles were generated programmatically. They were not a part of the original image file, which means I have to make an individual scene for every file just to add in the speech bubbles. But it should be worth the effort, so I ended up going with option 3. The files were split into chunks of around 3 to 5 images each, which were then subsequently loaded as the player read the comic. As soon as the player was halfway through what was available so far, a new batch of pages would be added. This was also helpful in tricking the player into thinking the comic was a short one and then hitting them with a massive amount of story. So I finally got a working comic system in place that loads properly and looks somewhat professional. I put it into my game and my goodness is it amazing. It's just so surreal that my story and my game is coming to life. At this time, there is still a lot more story that I need to draw, but at the very least, we are getting closer and closer to an actual playable demo, which is really exciting. So definitely stay tuned right here on my YouTube channel for when that comes out. I cannot wait. And of course, thank you so much for watching. Check out my game on Steam if you haven't already, and subscribe. You get the idea. See you next time.